Hi there. This is my commentary on Chapter 7 of Lila, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert M. Pirsig. Primarily what's happening in this chapter are two things. One, he's setting up how his philosophy is veering into understanding the social arena within the context mentioned earlier, Indian versus European, and how this has so affected the ways of believing and understanding in this country. This will be used as a launching point for a new understanding of evolution based on quality. The second is where you're going to start getting a sense of who Lila is and how she comes across as a person in the room, let's say. And in this case, the room is quite small. So let's start with an interesting reaction Phaedrus has to Rigel. He felt depressed that Rigel had really gotten to him. Someday, maybe, he would develop a thick enough skin to not get bothered by someone like that, but that day hadn't arrived yet. What depressed him most was the stupid way he let himself be set up for Rigel's attack. He had probably been invited to breakfast just to receive that little sermon. Now he'd brood for days and go over everything that was said and recycle every word over and over again to think of perfect answers he should have said at the time. Now, the reason I find this reaction interesting is because you would not think Phaedrus, who we know is this utter genius, would be so affected by Rigel's moralizing. You'd think that after he'd written this book about quality that he'd be above this kind of thing. But he isn't, and that's interesting. He's reacting the same way any of us would if we had been overpowered by someone with a much worse argument that we were capable of, and we weren't able of accessing our intellect in that moment to rebut when we needed to, and so we end up ruminating and stewing and wishing we had said something. So it's interesting. And flummoxed by the whole unpleasant breakfast, he tries to psychoanalyze Rigel to figure out why he's such a moralist. So let's do that to Phaedrus for a minute. Let's try to analyze him. He said on numerous occasions he's socially awkward. Remember him on the streetcar in San Francisco, too shy and awkward to make any kind of move towards the woman he thinks was Lila, and she knew it, and she and her friend made fun of him. So here's the same guy, this time in a dominance battle with an inferior adversary and behaving like, let's just say, someone who is kind of a beta. I don't know if that's the right thing to say, but he's struggling with his lack of social skills. Well, there's another explanation. So say he's socially awkward and social situations trigger his anxiety so he can't think. Now, when you're anxious, that happens. Anxiety is in the lower brain. And your prefrontal cortex cuts off when you're anxious. That's where you do all the analytical stuff, and you're able to give, coherent answers to challenges. And that's why therapists who are dealing with patients with anxiety often tell them, when you're in these kind of situations, you need to get your thinking brain back online because you're stuck in the emotional brain. You're stuck in the fight or flight mechanism. That's what anxiety is. It's a trigger for that more primitive survival mechanism. So you have to, if you have a problem with anxiety, you have to consciously get your thinking brain back online to deal with the situations, to deal with social situations. One of my supervisors once said that she had someone look at their watch, and that makes you concentrate on the numbers, on the time. I often tell people to do a math problem in their heads when they're in these situations because, it puts you back in that mode. It elevates the energy in your brain. So maybe it's partially that. Maybe he's having this anxiety problem during this. He's just so appalled by what Rigel's saying that it stresses him out and he becomes anxious and he can't rebut. But also remember what he said, that it was too complicated to try to explain what he means to Rigel. And this is the other part of the problem. You can read all of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and still not get what Pirsig is talking about. Rigel had read it, and he doesn't get it. All he sees is Zen, just fixing. Quality is what you like. There's no fixed morality. There's only quality, blah, blah, blah. And it seems to be a call to revolution. Like burn your bras and your draft card. So Pirsig, because he walks us through this process, is in the middle of expanding his theory to include morals. And so we actually get to see him working on it the same way we did in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So you're going to see him very vulnerable as he works through it. And he doesn't have an easy answer for Rigel. That's the problem. The feeling left was one of enormous confusion and weariness, a kind of back to the drawing board, back to square one feeling you get, where you're thinking you're making great progress, and then suddenly some question like this comes along and sets you back to where you started. He didn't even want to think about it. However, sometimes you really need to be shot down in order to get up again. And there's probably a very good reason to go back to the drawing board when this happens. And it takes a blow like this to see what you're missing, because otherwise you think you're, going along and everything's great, and you're missing a major aspect of what you're working on, or you're blind to something. And it really sometimes takes a very negative situation to see what you're missing, to see where your theory or your understanding isn't fleshed out enough, and there's this whole domain that it's not addressing. So these can actually be a good thing. So while this is a blow to Phaedrus's ego and that square one feeling, because what he's working on is very complicated, and to go back to square one is really daunting, it's a bonus for his theory. So when you look at his analysis of Rigel, you see his theory develop. First, he thinks Rigel is cutting him down to elevate himself, that it's an ego thing and it's a meanness thing. And whenever there's some morality, this is how people act. I mean, we certainly see this now going on with the protests. When you see the two sides fight each other, which we see a lot on the news today, you got these massive egos on both sides, and they're mean to each other. But that attitude doesn't explain it. So then he's wondering, well, is he trying to entrap me with this damned if you do, damned if you don't sex thing with Lila? And so that kind of makes him think, what is it about sex that's so immoral? All the while, his growing insight is mirrored by the topography, same as in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He sees the Victorian European influence, the further east, the further towards Manhattan he goes. Since he'd entered the Erie Canal system, he'd noticed how things seemed older and more tired. Now that feeling was even more dominant. Hundreds of years ago, these old waterways were the only way to travel in this continent. For a while, he had wondered why his boat always seems to stop in the oldest part of each city he came to, and then he realized that small boats stopping right here is what got the city started in the first place. So that's a great metaphor for what he has to do now, go back to the beginning, and what he does typically in his pursuit of his theory is he goes to the beginning of when whatever he's following, whether it's the ghost of reason or what is this insistence on a certain type of morality that Rigel has, he has to go back to the beginning. He always sees that he has to start with the origin of the pattern. So this is another topographical analogy of getting to the root of things, as he's trying to do with what exactly prompted the sermon from Rigel. Every time he came this way, he could feel the people getting more formal and impersonal and crafty, exploitative, European, and petty too, and ungenerous. Since he's from the Midwest, he explains another way of understanding. He contrasts this Eastern way with the Midwestern way, which we know is a combination of Indian and European. In a state like Minnesota or Wisconsin, you can be poor and still feel some sense of dignity if you work hard and live fairly cleanly and you keep your eye on the future. And I love that line, because this is exactly the antidote to the victim mentality that is being promoted right now. When we strip dignity from the poor, we strip away the one thing it would take for them to have agency. Why work or look forward to the future when you've been set up psychologically and, for that matter, in this case, bureaucratically, to fail? So this is another hidden gem of wisdom from Pirsig, because he does contrast these poor in the Midwest with dignity to the urban poor who believe they're nobody because they're poor. So I also want to mention a great book. If you don't know about it, it's called Albion's Seed, Albion being the old word for England, which demonstrates, and it's called something like Folkways, the folkways of different parts of England come over to America and they stick. And Americans, they still have some aspects of these different ways of being, these folkways from England. And the different parts of the United States on the East Coast and in the South are still very much influenced by the early English immigrants. So this is very similar to what Pirsig is doing here, is showing the influence from Europe in America. And here he describes another variation of that, kind of to explain why Easterners are the way they are. New England was settled by a completely different pattern of immigration. That was it. In the early days, New England was all one big WASP family staying put. But this valley was everybody on the move: Dutch, English, French, German, Irish, and their relations were often hostile. So this is the Hudson River Valley, which for Phaedrus might explain the Eastern attitude of hostility, standoffishness, that attitude you think New Yorkers have. So maybe Rigel's problem is that he's an Easterner. So he's still analyzing, he's using this to continue to analyze Rigel. But of course, that's not the problem either. So then he starts thinking, because Rigel's read his book and stuff, maybe he's thinking, well, he's a celebrity. And in the United States, celebrities get it from two sides, because we have the Indian attitude of equality, which we mentioned is, like an incredibly important thing that we've gotten from the Indians and that defines us. But we also get American exceptionalism, and we get that from Europe. So you have equality and exceptionalism, and obviously it's a paradox. Obviously, we have this conflict in our culture. So a celebrity can be admired for being exceptional and disparaged for making us feel inferior. So maybe it's this internal conflict in Rigel that is causing him to behave towards Phaedrus the way he is. The old Indians knew how to handle it. They just got rid of anything anybody wanted. They didn't own property. They dressed in rags, some of them. They kept it down, laid low, and let the aristocrats and egalitarians and sycophants and assassins all look on them as worthless. That way they got a lot accomplished without all the celebrity grief. So that's kind of interesting, because that is what the monks in the East do. They go out with their begging bowls. They don't have any possessions. And of course, the most famous mystical religious leader of all time, we know who that is, also said, lay down your possessions and follow me. So you could even say that this is all tied up in the mystical materialist dichotomy that we think about a lot even today, and also infuses our morality, because deep in our morality, if you are pious, you're not supposed to value material items. You can't worship God and mammon at the same time. And there's actually a lot of wisdom to that. So what he will do coming up here is he's going to grill Lila about Rigel. He absolutely wants to get to the bottom of this to see if she can give him some insight. And maybe, again, we can see this obsession with Rigel as trying to figure out this thing that he's missing in his theory, and that's actually what's going on. It's interesting, he hammers Lila about it to the point where she gets all upset. She gets pissed off. She has no interest in this kind of analysis. So what is she interested in? Let's get into the second part of the chapter, which is about Lila. She's very in the moment. She wants to eat. She wants to eat now. And overall, the impression you get from her is someone with really little ability to reflect. She knows what she wants. She wants it now, and that's good enough for her. So listen to this. It sounds like a child. Well, we're underway, he said. We have to use this current while it's with us, or we lose a whole day. Tonight we'll have a big meal. Tonight? Yeah, he said. He heard her mutter, peanut butter and junk food. Don't you have anything at all? Oh, wait a minute, she said. Here's half a bar of chocolate. He heard her say, ugh. What's the matter, he asked. There's something wrong with it. It tastes stale. How about some coffee? Do you have any coffee? Her voice sounded pleading. He paints a picture of someone without any real aim outside the immediate. What she's done is she's capitalized on her looks. She's done what just people responded to naturally. And Rigel has as much as said so. And now that they are fading, she's kind of in this position where she's not, dating highfalutin guys. She's out hanging out in the docks, dating these guys who have these boats. So what's left is a kind of rough individual who may have lost her looks, but she still retains some sex appeal. She moved to sit across from him. The four letters of Love shifted around in provocative directions. She's probably wearing a t-shirt from the 70s that she's had for a long time, back when, it made more of an impact, but still makes an impact. And she seems to have lived this transient lifestyle. She hasn't been able to, or doesn't have the ability to concentrate on anything long enough to really get anywhere, just living off these guys in a very low-level way these days. But she learns what she needs to make it in the world, in that world, let's just say. She can fit into, this low-level world, including, he asked her, do you know how to steer one of these boats, he asked. Of course, she said. So here's another indication of part of her attitude. It must be nice to have a boat like this, all your own, she said. Nobody ever tells you what to do. You just move on. So you certainly get the idea that Lila does not want anyone to tell her what to do. And this adds to that in-the-moment pleasure-seeking personality and where it gets you, pursuing moment-to-moment satisfaction and ending up with lower and lower end scenarios like the one she's in now with this aging author who, even if she knew who he was, she probably wouldn't be impressed. Not like her banker whose life she supposedly ruined. But she keeps going, doing the best she can. I mean, what else can she do? And this is pretty much confirmed when Phaedrus asks her about her career. What jobs did you do? Lots of different jobs. What did you do? Secretary, she said. Oh, he said. That sort of exhausted that. He didn't want to hear anything about her typing. Well, my guess is she never typed a word in her life. Secretary is certainly what she could have done in her position, but she didn't. So either way, the way she went, and we know the way she went, but she could have also been a secretary. But either way is pretty much nowhere for a woman. So it kind of makes you think of a time of what Lila is supposed to represent to Rigel. Now, if you're thinking about Rigel, and we're going to get to this in a little bit, but just think of a time where women really didn't have many choices. You could, if you weren't married, you could be a secretary, an office clerk, or you could go in a direction where you somehow make a living off of men, one way or another. So Lila is a very typical fallen woman in the sense that we are talking about, in the Victorian sense. So he's still reflecting on her, and he says, what a change, and he thinks, what a change from last night. No illumination today, just this kind of dull face staring ahead, not looking at anything in particular. So that was the booze. Booze is very seductive because it transforms the dull to the illuminated almost instantly. Yet we know, actually, that it's more than booze in this particular case, because we know that during that moment of illumination, something was revealed that is much deeper, not unlike what was revealed during that peyote ceremony, that through someone like Lila can be channeled something infinite and transcendent. But now he's contending with the flesh and blood Lila, not the Lila of the previous evening. He watched her for a while. It certainly wasn't an evil face, though, not low quality. You could see it as pretty if you wanted to. The eyes were out of place somehow. Her whole face and body and style of talking and action were all tough and ready for anything. But those eyes, when she looked right at you, were something else. Like some frightened child looking up from the bottom of a well. They didn't fit at all. So there is this incongruence in Lila, something we don't know yet, but something, again, that transcends her rough self through her eyes. As he grills her about Rigel, he discovers that Lila does not think Rigel is a particularly moral person. And so maybe he comes across an answer to what was Rigel up to. And Lila says, that's the way he gets sometimes. He's moody. He also likes to tell other people what to do. But you said he was not especially moral. Why would he pick on morals? I don't know. He gets it from his mother. He gets everything from his mother. That's the way he talks sometimes. But he doesn't really mean it. He's just moody. So maybe that explains Rigel's attitude, moodiness. But, of course, that's not it either. So as Phaedrus is musing on these Victorian mansions that he's passing by on his boat with their oppressive, overwrought posture and lifelessness, he begins to get the insight into Rigel that he needs to understand. Victorian spirit, a whole attitude toward life, quality they called it, European quality, full of status and protocol. It had the same feeling as Rigel's sermon this morning, the social pattern that created that sermon on morality and the one that created these mansions were the same. It wasn't just Eastern, it was Victorian. The Victorians always took themselves seriously, and the thing they took most seriously of all was their code of morality, or virtue as they like to call it. So were they puritanical? Not really, because the Puritans came about their own morality from a you could call it a direct connection with quality. It was the deepest and richest experience of God. So much so they were willing to put up with Plymouth. And if you know anything about the people coming over and to Plymouth Rock and settling around there, it was absolutely brutal. And they put up with a lot for their faith. So that dynamic experience of quality and their actual connection with God got them through one of the most horrendous immigration stories imaginable. The Victorians, not really a comparison. They became very rich and they built these mansions. He got an image of them standing back of Rigel's shoulder at breakfast this morning, endorsing every word Rigel said. They would have, too. That superiority Rigel asserted this morning was exactly the pose they would have affected. Smug posing was the essence of their style. That's what these mansions were, poses, turrets and gingerbread and ornamental cast iron. Now, I love this because this is just this really hits hard, this next paragraph. The period ended when, after having defined for all time what truth and virtue and quality are, the Victorians and their Edwardian successors sent an entire generation of children into the trenches of the First World War on behalf of these ideals and murdered them for nothing. That war was the natural consequence of Victorian moral egotism. Basically, the war was the advent of being trapped in this moral ideology, which the Victorians ended up substituting for a holistic view of reality. A very narrow view, a very moralistic view. And when a whole culture is in a Gumption trap, when all of Europe is in a Gumption trap, very bad things can happen. And just like our own personal traps, it may take Rigel coming and lecturing us about morality. It may take some kind of bad thing, such as a war, to open up that crack and let the light in. And after, of course, the First World War, we know what happened. Things really transformed, and modernism, as we know it, began. Now we get the gist of all this rumination and interrogation and everything Phaedrus is doing in his obsession. Rigel is a representative of Victorian morality. So how does this all line up? How is it then that Rigel and Lila, in relationship to each other, figure into this theory? Well, they're at moral odds with each other, each representing a different side. Rigel, the Victorian, hating Lila for being the fallen woman who has no eye on posing as anything other than what she is, and who is not motivated by anything other than her own needs. So she's her id self, an anathema to the Victorian superego morality. They're two very different moral systems. And then he comes to the fruit of all this labor and is going to take us into the next step of his theory. Quality is morality. Make no mistake about it. They're identical. And if quality is the primary reality of the world, then that means morality is also the primary reality of the world. The world is primarily a moral order. So that was worth this fight that was worth this lecture by Miguel to go back to square one, because this is where we are now. So this is very interesting. This is going to be the trajectory of the book. What does it mean that quality is morality and that the world is primarily a moral order? He can't explain anything to Rigel. Rigel is stuck inside this Victorian moral immune system, and Phaedrus would not have been able to convey quality to Rigel because there's no opening to get it in. To open someone's mind who's in a value trap such as this is perhaps to maybe explain the whole theory from scratch, to go back again to the beginning of where this all started. And it seems like it's, again, something Phaedrus has to do again and again, but he does it in the book, The Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Rigel read the book and interpreted it through his own lens. So even that isn't going to work with Rigel. How about Lila? Could she understand? What kind of quality does she possess? Is this the kind of quality that will allow for a deep understanding as seen through those blue eyes last night? It doesn't look that way at all this morning. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.